I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're about to hear my ongoing fantasy serial. Like the Skalds it's named for, I write these stories to be heard, not read. And there's no music, sound effects, or character actors. It's all me, and I do it in one single, flawless take. This episode starts where the last one ended. So if you'd like to hear a story from the beginning, you might want to go back and listen to previous episodes before moving ahead. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 19. Enleth hated the Vanquishing. No, that wasn't exactly right. She loved the Vanquishing. It was what had allowed her people, led by her ancestors, to defeat their rivals, to crush their enemies, to secure their borders in this, the world they claimed for themselves, the one they declared the Elf Realm, in the time directly following Sundering. No, she didn't hate the Vanquishing. She hated the empty, facile celebration of the event, the one that even though her people were millennia removed from the actual victory, she must still endure year after painful year. When her father was still alive, she had begged and pleaded to stay home from the Vanquishing celebration, but to no avail. The best she had ever achieved was a compromise. If she would attend the celebration, if she would stand on the stage reserved for the royal family, smiling sweetly while her father, the king, gave his annual speech, then she would be excused from giving one of her own, as was customary for the royal heir. So she, as the princess, the eldest daughter, the chosen heir of the Elf King, had stood there, a fake smile plastered on her face, suffering through her father's shallow, jingoistic platitudes. After Maul had been taken away, his savage influence on her had waned, and she'd embraced her studies with the Elven Masters. History, mathematics, science, she'd excelled in them all, but the one she loved best was logic. Logic had been her favorite because it was the field of study that made all others possible, that allowed historians to draw conclusions from the past, gave mathematics its rules, and guided science's hand in discovery. Logic was what gave form to the dialectic, the exquisite art by which one person and another, or perhaps just one with herself, could discuss, could have a dialogue, could learn something, and could come to a meaningful conclusion. Dialectic is logic put to its best, purest use, and as such was far removed from the rhetoric. While the dialectic used logic for good, to solve problems, to come to understandings, to educate, the rhetoric put logic's considerable powers to ill use, utilizing ambiguities, empty phrasing, and emotional appeals in order to force someone to accept a position that was not their own. The dialectic was a dialogue, but the rhetoric was the tool of an orator, of a politician who couldn't properly explain his position, or even worse, didn't want to. The dialectic was a finely honed tool. The rhetoric was a blunt hammer. Enleth had listened to her father address the Vanquishing Day crowd, wielding that blunt hammer with impunity. Not because he had to, but because it was the most expedient way to get what he wanted, what he needed, what was best for the kingdom. Her father had been a benevolent dictator, in Enleth's eyes, too benevolent. So he only wanted what was best for the people. But amongst his subjects, there were those who didn't want what was best for the kingdom. Rather, what was best for themselves. Given enough time, Enleth knew that her father, that brilliant man, could have debated those rabble-rousers into submission, using the fine point of the dialectic to chip away at the shaky foundations of their arguments. But at what cost? How much time would be wasted? Would the very point they argued over be rendered moot by the time they had reached some tenuous agreement, a compromise that achieved no one's objectives? This is what Enleth's father had explained to her, repeatedly, in painstaking detail. But still, her blood had boiled as she listened to him lower himself, denigrate himself to the level of an angry demagogue or a street corner preacher. Though he did it with good intentions and a good effect, it still sickened her to see that brilliant man use such base, such common, rhetorical tricks. She had pledged to never fall into the same trap, to never encourage her subjects' ignorance through the use of rhetoric, to never muddy the waters in the name of expediency. But shortly after taking the throne, in the wake of Maul's unspeakable brutality and cruelty, she had learned that her pledge was as noble as it was impractical. So on the first Vanquishing celebration of her still new reign, she had taken the podium and spat out as banal and empty sentiments as she had ever had the misfortune to hear. The same rhetoric that would have caused her to spit just a few months prior now slid from her mouth in honeyed phrases that elicited gasps, tears, and applause from the crowd at all the right moments. She reminded them of where they came from, told them the national myth that they already knew. She complimented the crowd by comparing them to their forefathers. She boasted of their strength as a people, and she trotted out well-chosen subjects, anecdotal evidence to prove whatever point her cynical advisors had thought most crucial to nail home. It sickened her, but it also bored her. It was so easy to manipulate those who wanted to be manipulated. That was the basic principle by which all magicians and con artists plied their trade, wasn't it? And they weren't wrong. Her people wanted to be reassured, to be complimented, to be petted and pampered like foolish beasts. So it was easy enough to oblige them. There was one piece of her speech, however, she enjoyed, one part that she could speak honestly, her voice rising with the power of a truth held dear. And that part was the conclusion, when she, to massive cheers that shook the stone walls surrounding the city, when she claimed that they were hot on the trail of the murderous assassin who had killed her father, her entire family, the people's royal family, and that they were about to unleash a weapon with which he could not possibly contend. Of course, she didn't mention the weapon by name. The people were there to be consoled and entertained, not horrified and disgusted. No, their narrow shoulders would be spared the heavy knowledge of the horror she planned to unleash in their name, that she had to unleash in their name, the horror of the Feldrun. As the cheers rang out, Enleth and her honor guard began to take leave of the plaza, to make the trip back to her palace by foot, as was customary on the day of the Vanquishing celebration. But as the crowd parted in front of her, one stone-faced elf refused to budge, except to extend a long, emaciated arm, his finger pointed directly at Queen of the Elves. Pretty words. Very pretty words. But I cannot eat words. My children cannot eat words. Enleth's guard prepared to remove the elf. If he wanted to eat, he could eat crusts of bread in the dungeons beneath the palace. But Enleth, her cold eyes warming, put a hand out to stop her heavily armed attendants. The poor elf knew that he had been spared. But for what? To go home once again? To go home to a house full of hungry mouths and distended bellies? No, that was unacceptable. It wasn't an option. So he continued on. Pretty talk from a pretty queen, but a queen who showers her subjects with compliments and empty speeches instead of giving them what they need. The crowd closest to Enleth had already quieted, and the hush was spreading throughout the plaza. Enleth knew that she had to make a choice quickly, and more importantly, she knew that once made, she had to stand by her choice with authority. Tell me then, what is it that you want? The hungry elf is shocked. What? Food? I need food. Very well then. Enleth turned to the advisors that followed close behind her. Open up soup kitchens, one in every ward. Keep them open for as long as the hungry keep coming. I will eat at them myself once a week, and I would have the food be hearty, wholesome, and nourishing. The emaciated elf stared in amazement as his friends clapped him on his bony back and sang Enleth's praises. But the queen's advisors were nowhere near as delighted. Of course, my queen, of course, whatever you desire, it shall be done. But how, pray tell, shall we pay for this new outreach? How do you pay for anything? With money, you fools. And if you don't have enough, sell things. Sell whatever you need to. Sell my boots if you have to. Cheers began rising once again, rising to deafening levels. I am the queen of the elves, and I will not have my people starve. Walking back to the palace, waving and smiling at her subjects, but well insulated from their adulation, Enleth conferred with her advisors. They talked of taxes, internal disputes, and future government appointees, the type of inane minutia that Enleth struggled to take an interest in. There was one topic she was more than willing to discuss. And that brings us to your new weapon, Your Highness. Even those in Enleth's inner circle couldn't bring themselves to say the name unless utterly necessary. The name of the Feldrun. It's full grown now, and it has been for some time. If it is to maintain its vitality, it must eat regularly. I already told you, didn't I? None of my subjects shall starve. Enleth grinned. Fetch the ropes, the ones we saved from the world tree. Throw them into the pit so it can get the beast sent. The advisor shuddered at the mere thought of the Feldrun. Yes, Your Highness, it will be done. Good. Do it quickly. If the branch is sprouting, then we don't have much time. You know the power it contains, especially in the hands of one such as Maul. Take the... Enleth forced herself to say the word. Take the Feldrun. Take it to that squalid border realm, to the city where we last saw the beast. Take it there and release it. A second advisor leaned in to speak quietly in his queen's ear. My queen knows best, of course, but to unleash that thing inside a city, the loss of life, it'll be catastrophic. And what do you think will happen if we allow that murderous beast to go free? Have it done. So says your queen. After returning with the horn, that long, twisting alabaster horn, Skog had attempted to wake Maul, had nudged his head with her nose, had let a soft growl rise up in her throat, had nibbled the flesh of his arm to get his attention. But it was no use. He was out, gone, no one was there. Skog worried that he was dead, that her race along the riverbank, her excursion to that grim abattoir, her dalliance with his supplicants, that it had all been for naught. For a brief moment, the massive cat beast began to panic. Still clenching the horn in her massive jaws, she turned for the first time to the godless monk, Xylan, who laid nearby, face down in the dirt. With less care than the monk would have preferred, if he had been conscious, that is, Skog rolled Xylan over, the better to get a look at him. Like Maul, he was unresponsive to Skog's nudges, growls, and gentle bites. So she went back to her companion, pushed his cudgel up against his side, and sat down to wait. She watched over Maul, only half sleeping so as to stay alert during the night, letting out a cautionary growl whenever she sensed another beast draw near. At dawn, Skog nudged Maul in another attempt to rouse him. But it was no use. So she let out a low growl, then realized that her throat wasn't the only thing growling, as her stomach reminded her that it had been almost a day since she last ate. Skog knew that if she were to guard Maul, to protect him from what lurked in this forgotten chasm, then she would need her strength. She would need to feast, to consume the power that raw flesh and muscle contained. And she would need to do it soon. She also knew that if Maul awakened, when Maul awakened, he would be starving, at least as hungry as Skog. When Maul regained consciousness, he would want two things: food and the horn. The horn. Skog still clutched it in her jaws, just as she had done the entire night long. She didn't want to let it out of her sight. Delving into that bloody, obscene cave had been a necessity. But it was not one that she wanted to repeat. She could go the rest of her life without taking in the malodorous stench of the supplicants, without feeling the priest's wicked smile upon her. But an aversion to his servants wasn't the only thing that led her to feel protective of the horn. There was also something else. A compulsion. A sound she could barely hear and scarcely understand. A voice that was both gentle and forceful, pleading and commanding, speaking of ideas that Skog couldn't grasp, of plans she couldn't conceive, and of a dream, a goal, a destiny. It was wholly unfathomable. It was just a horn. A long, twisting alabaster horn. But at the end of the day, nothing more to one such as Skog. It was nothing more than a bone, and you can't eat bones. It was even more useless than a bone. As a bone, she could at least crack open, then suck out the marrow from within. She'd retrieved that long, twisting alabaster horn for Maul, and she would not have it lost again. But despite what that cajoling voice had said, she had no real reason to keep it with her. Skog would need her mighty jaws free to not only catch her quarry, but also drag it back to Maul. So without a second thought, Skog walked into the brush, dug a hole, and buried the horn. Then, after a final, hopeful glance back at Maul, a futile effort to will him awake, she prowled off, body lowered, and ready to pounce. Skog was ravenous, but if she had her druthers, she wouldn't just seize the first game she stumbled upon. Instead, she would lie in wait, watching, smelling, listening, searching, not just for acceptable sustenance, but for satisfying sustenance. Getting what you need is good, but getting what you want is far better. And what Skog wanted was a fattened deer, like the doe she had smelled the day before. She wanted something fast and fleet, something that would bring challenge to her hunt, a challenge that would in turn bring a sweetness to that bloody, rich-tasting venison. But Skog had no way of knowing how long a hunt like that could take, especially in this strange gorge where his followers lurked, and what little forest there was. Even if Skog had time to return to the place where the ravine had widened, filling with that debauched forest, even if it wasn't so far away, Skog had no desire to go back to it. So instead of a tender doe, instead of a young, sweet fawn or a mighty, muscular buck, the massive cat settled for the first edible beast she came across, some fat, almost completely flightless species of bird. The ridiculous thing must have never seen a beast like Skog before, because when it did, it simply sat, staring into the eyes of its coming doom. It wasn't until the moment that Skog's razor-sharp teeth sunk into its neck that it realized that whatever this massive creature was, it was something to be feared. Killing the bird was so easy that Skog continued her hunt, taking 3 more of the beasts. She hoped, after all, that Maul, perhaps even the monk too, would be awake when she returned. Awake and ravenous. And if they weren't, well, Skog was extremely hungry. Skog held all 3 birds by their skinny necks, running briskly through the forest. She had finished her hunt, so stealth was no longer a concern. She wasn't listening, and instead allowed the pleasing sound of her heavy paws crashing through the brush to fill her ears. If she had been listening, she would have heard it before she saw it, turning a bend and stopping in shock as she saw a human figure bent over the ground, digging in the precise spot where she had buried the horn. The figure turned, clutching the long, twisting alabaster horn in his fist, a gleaming smile on his face. To Skog's delight, Maul's smile grew wider as he called to her. "Good girl. I'm starving." If you like SKALD, please help spread the word with a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It helps new people find the podcast, and if you say nice stuff, I'll read it on the show. Bear1717 on iTunes says, "This story has me wishing away my days to get to the next episode. Very cool. Nothing else like it." Reviews are great to help spread the word, but the best way to help SKALD is by contributing to the Patreon campaign at patreon.com/SKALD. Patreon is a safe, secure way to pledge small monthly dollar amounts to the things you love. Things like SKALD. This show is listener supported, so I depend on you to keep it going. I am all over the internet. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they're all Aubrey Sitterson. No spaces, no numbers. Or head over to my website, aubreysitterson.com, for links to everything, including social media, my non-SKALD related projects, comics, podcasts, t-shirts, credits, bio, and contact information. I've recommended some rad stuff. I've recommended my favorite stuff. That's the whole idea. But I haven't called out a comic just yet. That changes now, as I give my absolute highest recommendation to Marvel's Weird World by Jason Aaron and Mike Del Mundo. It's part of Marvel's Secret Wars event and is an amazingly gonzo take on sword and sorcery fiction. If you dig SKALD, I have a feeling this will scratch your itch, because it's definitely scratching mine. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.